We'll get started with some short introductions. So good afternoon or good morning from Seattle. Welcome to the monthly lecture series, Encountering Asia, Plunder and Collectors. I am Natalia, the Assistant Curator of South Asian Art here at SAM. Feel free to type in the chat what city or country you are joining us from. Welcome back to those who are returning, and welcome to anyone attending for the first time. For some housekeeping, because of Omicron, our plans for a hybrid event at the Asian Art Museum's Gardner Center had to be postponed. Here at SAM, everyone's safety is our first priority. We apologize to our ticket holders who are looking forward to an in-person event. And we will keep our audience updated if the next lecture will be hybrid or virtual as we continue to monitor the situation. To formally begin, the Seattle Art Museum would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Duwamish and the customary territories of the Suquamish and Muckleshoot peoples. As a cultural and educational institution, we honor our ongoing connection to these communities, past, present, and future. We also would like to acknowledge the many urban Native peoples from many nations who call Seattle their home. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today. Peter Lape is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington. He is also the curator of archaeology and associate director for research and collections at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture. And for many of you, the Burke is a very familiar and wonderful institution. We're very lucky to have it here in Seattle. Born in New Hampshire, Lape received his BA in physics in 1985 from the University of New Hampshire, MA in museum studies in 1994 from San Francisco State University, and a PhD in anthropology in 2000 from Brown University. He is an archaeologist specializing in the histories of social change in island Southeast Asia over the last 4,000 years. His research focuses on island landscapes and seascapes, cross-cultural interactions such as trade and warfare, human environmental dynamics, and climate change. He has conducted collaborative fieldwork in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Philippines. He also has an interest in archaeological practice, cultural resource management, and public archaeology in the South and Southeast Asia and the US, and has ongoing collaborations with Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest of the US. So with that, we are so grateful to introduce Peter and to have him speak. Peter, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, good morning, everybody. And thank you, Natalia, for that nice introduction. And also thanks to Sam and the Gardner Center for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor to be here with you all. Slightly different audience than I normally get to work with. So I'm really looking forward to talking and hearing your questions later on today. I also wanted to thank the SAM staff, especially Shaolin, Rachel, and Sophia for being incredibly competent in setting up this talk, especially with our last minute changes. I'm disappointed we can't be in person, but I'm glad we can do this. So, and thanks to all of you for joining us in morning if you're in Seattle or on the West Coast, whatever time of day it is for you, where you are. For those of us in Seattle, we are kind of at the peak of dark and rainy. So I hope, you know, some pictures of beautiful tropical islands and thinking about spices can lift your spirits a bit today. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So hopefully everyone can see that. So my talk today has 3 acts. I'll begin with a kind of a short recounting of the spice trade as we understand it from written documentary historical sources. This might be a story you're already familiar with, but I'll, for those of you who aren't, I'll kind of go over the basics. Then I'll share with you a little bit about how the archaeological record can add or change that story. And then finally, I'd like to muse a little bit about what this all means, especially for us living here and now. So that's the outline of my talk. So starting with spice trade. So you're looking at a map here of spice trade routes. Basically for the last couple thousand years, spices have been moving through Asia and making their way from the spice sources in South and Southeast Asia to mainland Asia, to the Middle East, where they interact with trade routes that also connect East Africa. And some of these things eventually make their way into Europe. So this is really a global trade network, although it doesn't include, at least at this stage, really Australia or the Americas, although there are some possible connections there. But this is really a Africa, Europe, Asia global connection. So if you can see my cursor here, we're going to be talking about this part of the world down here and what today is Indonesia. So these were sources of some of these important spices. Now, these spices were increasingly in demand in Europe, starting in the Middle Ages. Some of them, such as nutmeg, became very important, very valuable. And starting in the 16th century and then really ramping up in this early 17th century, Europeans started making an effort to bypass all of those short land and sea routes and go directly to the sources of the spices in Southeast Asia. And so here's an example of a ship, the Batavia, famously that shipwrecked in Australia. Some great stories about cannibalism and all that happened with the survivors of the shipwreck in West Australia. But this was basically the highest technology of the day of shipbuilding and sailing. And it allowed them to sail without stopping, or maybe only one stop, all the way from Amsterdam to Southeast Asia, where they could buy nutmeg and cloves and things like that directly from the producers, and then come back to Europe and sell them at huge profits. So this was the profit motive was what partly was driving this kind of change in the routes to this more direct route. Now, if we take a look at one of these spices, nutmeg, or actually nutmeg and mace, they're 2 different spices, but they come from the same plant. Just a little background here. The photo on the left is a picture of the nutmeg kind of in the wild. So nutmeg is, the spice is actually the pit of a fruit that looks a lot like a peach or a nectarine or apricot, actually, more kind of has a fuzzy skin. The fruit flesh you can eat, pretty tasty actually. And then the spice we know comes from the pit of this fruit. And then the red thing on the outside of that pit is mace. So it's this kind of fibrous, it's called an aril, but it's basically part of the seed of the fruit. Has a very similar flavor to nutmeg, a little bit milder. So that's nutmeg. Now in Europe, starting in the Middle Ages, it became known as a way to prevent bubonic plague. So sort of like the Pfizer shot of the day. And this is largely what drove the initial rise in demand for nutmeg in Europe, was this anti-plague medicine. It also became, because of its high price, it became associated with wealth and status. And so as people in Europe became this upper class of wealthy who had to display their wealth, part of that display was to have these feasts and to show off your kind of wealth by showing the exotic foods that you could serve to your cohort. So nutmeg became this kind of a status symbol for feasting. And it's all kind of funny that nutmeg, now you can go to Safeway and buy a jar of nutmeg for $3.99. It's really lost its coolness in the world, and is most famous for pumpkin spice lattes and that kind of thing. But it has this deep history in Western culture as the status symbol. So zooming in now to the sources, or the places where these spices originally come from. This is a map of what today is the nation of Indonesia. And nutmeg comes from these tiny little islands that are just probably a speck on your screen, or maybe they don't even show up on your screen down here, in what's known as the Moluccas or Maluku, a province of Indonesia. And cloves come from another set of islands to the north up here. And cloves are they're the unopened flower bud of the clove tree that you break off and dry to make the clove spice. So both of these trees were endemic to islands and probably evolved in these very specific places under very specific environmental conditions. So we're going to zoom into the Banda Islands here, which is there's those tiny specks where nutmeg comes from. And this is a zoomed in map of the Bandas. So you can see it's made up of several pretty small islands. The largest one here, it's called Big Banda. Banda Besar is only about 7 kilometers or maybe 4.5 miles long. Most of the islands are just sort of a mile in diameter. So quite small, little volcanic specks in the middle of a fairly empty Maluku Sea. So the story of the spice trade really hinges on an event and this guy here named Jan Pieterszoon Koen. So he is a Dutch sailor who joined some of the earliest Dutch voyages to Indonesia and rose rapidly through the ranks and eventually became the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company. So this big kind of first multinational corporation. It's often known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. So Koen became the Governor General of the VOC in 1618, kind of just as they were making inroads into Indonesia and other parts of Asia to get a monopoly on the trade in spices. Very interesting fellow, this guy here. We'll take a look. There we go. So this is Koen eventually organizes with the support of the Dutch East India Company. He organizes an invasion of the Banda Islands to establish monopoly trade. So the strategy here was to basically expel the indigenous population of the Banda Islands and replace it with a plantation system managed by Dutch plantation owners and staffed by enslaved people that were imported from other parts of Asia, as far away as Africa or South Asia. And this all culminates in May of 1621 when Koen organizes this military invasion of the islands. So he brings a cohort of several hundred Japanese mercenary soldiers who were employed by the Dutch East India Company, over 1,000 ships. cannons, guns, and they basically take over and kill off all the traditional leaders of the Banda Islands, and then either kill or force to flee or capture something like 90% of the population of about 15,000 people who were living there at the time. So this is we see this kind of gruesome painting here was painted in the 1980s, but it commemorates this day when the 12 traditional leaders of the Banda Islands were killed by the Dutch soldiers. And you can see kind of in the background here, one of the Dutch forts. Part of the conflict was about this fort, about the local people, not wanting this fort to be built. This kind of culminated in this violent encounter. So Koen was celebrated for this invasion and honored on his return to the Netherlands. And it's interesting, just as here in the US, we're kind of reconsidering a lot of our statuary, particularly around the Black Lives Matter movement and statues of Confederate leaders and others. In the Netherlands, similarly, there's a kind of reconsideration in the last year or so of these colonial leaders. And so there's a famous statue of Koen in the town of Hoorn in the Netherlands. There's a big protest in 2021 and calls to take the statue down. It's still standing as far as I know right now, but possibly will be taken down and moved somewhere else. So a real kind of reconsideration of the Netherlands colonial history. Okay, so but going back to 1621, the invasion was basically a success, at least in terms of the VOC's strategy. And they successfully turned the Banda Islands into a plantation system. And so here's a map from, I think, 1626, showing one of the islands divided up into these plantation plots. And there's little numbers, might be hard for you to see down here, which is the number of slaves that would take to run each of these land plots. So here's 20. Xylan means actually souls, but 20 people basically to run each of these, 18 here, 10 here, etc. So the Banda Islands really became sort of a Dutch outpost, although very problematic and full of controversy and troubles in the years ahead, but it did work at first. So, but what do we know of the Banda Islands before 1621? And this is where my curiosity came in when I was first looking for a research project for my PhD dissertation. I was interested in kind of colonial history and what the dynamics were leading up to events like the Massacre of Banda 1621. So we don't know that much. People in Banda did not have a written language or an archival record. So there are some little clues from other visitors from China, the Middle East, and Europe. Occasionally left little traces like this map, Dutch map of the island from 1599, kind of showing a pre-conquest village layout of the Bandas. So there are little clues like that, but not a lot to go on. So here's where I moved to Act 2 to talk about what archaeological data has added to this story. And I guess partly about what the limitations of that data are. There's only so much we can do with this material record, but it has brought some new information to light about the Banda Islands. So let's shift gears and move into there. So I first started working in the Bandas in 1997 and have gone back a few times with different groups. That bottom picture is actually a group of local high school students from the high school in Banda and their teacher there on the left. And then I've returned with other Indonesian archaeologists, collaborators, local people, students from UW, students from Indonesian universities. So lots of different groups and lots of fun. I have tended to work, I really enjoy working with local communities. I found it's brought incredible things to my research to work closely with people who live in the places and have a deep connection to the places where I'm excavating. So my projects have always involved local people, often kids, especially high school kids or young people are just a really good way into a community. They can be wonderful, enthusiastic partners in my research. The picture on the right there is actually in the Burke Museum. That's Hendy, 18-year-old guy who lived in Pu'ai, and he was a fantastic archaeologist, and he found the first piece of obsidian. He's holding this in his hand right there, this volcanic glass from a very ancient site on his home island. And then we have some girls from the Banda High School and then some junior high kids from one of the other islands working with us. So lots of kids, lots of fun. So briefly, what we found lots of things about this kind of lead up to that massacre. So the few hundred years before the Dutch show up on the Banda, what was going on there? So that map that I showed you, that 1599 map, if you zoom into it, and I've spent hours looking at this map, it's actually in my office hanging up right there behind me. I have a copy from the archives. You can see this group of houses here with walls, and if you follow my cursor there, there's this kind of seawall going surrounding this village. So this is an indigenous fortification. And I've worked in other parts of Southeast Asia looking at these indigenous fortifications and trying to understand why they're there, when they first start being built, and kind of what's going on with those things. So that map led us to look at some other places in the Banda Islands where we found similarly this kind of massive wall surrounding these settlements. So you're looking at, in this photo down here, the top of about a 10-foot high wall that surrounded a village just landward of that beach there. So a massive structure that, because we're in a volcanic island, has now been kind of totally smothered by volcanic ash deposits. So you wouldn't really know it just walking around there until you start digging and find this massive wall. Another thing that I found, so some of the early Portuguese and Dutch accounts of the Bandas talk about internal conflicts between villages in the Bandas. The Europeans don't really understand why these people are fighting each other, but they do record it, and they actually use these conflicts to their advantage strategically. You know, they could kind of get alliances with one group against another, which would help them kind of get inroads into the land there. So that's an image from 1599 showing a battle that the Dutch recorded between two villages, Naira and Lautaka. We excavated it at Lautaka, and what we found there was interesting. Although most of the Banda Islands were, people were Muslim, by the time the Portuguese first get there in the 1513s or 12s, there were places in Banda that people were still eating a lot of pig, and which was a very, very important food all through Southeast Asia. But giving up or abandoning the eating of pig is an important symbol of your of becoming a Muslim person. So it seemed as though there were places that kind of holdouts to this conversion to Islam, and maybe part of the conflict or tension between these villages had to do with this kind of religious aspect. And this is borne out also by, if you looked in some of the archival documents, there was little clues there about like leaders' titles and other things that kind of built on this story of this kind of a religious conflict going on internal to the Bandas. And we also found, of course, a deep connection of Banda to the world that predated European presence. So going back maybe as early as around 800 CE, we find connections between Banda and mainland Asia, lots of Chinese made pottery, but also pottery from Vietnam, from Thailand, probably from Cambodia. So showing Banda's kind of intensive connection to the world. You know, these very remote islands are already in this world trading network very early. And we also find earthenware pottery that shows this connection between Banda and other parts of Maluku, this wider Eastern Indonesian region. So this is my friend Sofian holding this bird head or parrot head piece that's part of this tradition that's very local to the Banda Islands and other nearby islands that we think had something to do with a burial tradition. And it only shows up in a few other places, and it dates back to about 1500 years ago. So it shows this kind of regional connection between Banda and other islands nearby. Now we also, in addition to this kind of late pre-colonial period, some of the sites we investigated went back much deeper in time. So here we are actually literally deep down, about 10 feet down in a pit on one of the outer islands, Pulau I, where we found a quite amazing, what's called Neolithic period. It's time between about 2,500 and 3,500 years ago. And so this pit, it's one of the best preserved and earliest Neolithic sites in Indonesia. So it tells us a lot about what's going on in this important period in island Southeast Asia. So I'm down on the bottom of this pit with my colleague Dao Tenudirja, who's an archaeologist at Gajah Mada University in Indonesia. We partnered over several field seasons to investigate this time period. And what we find in those places, the artifacts look kind of like this. So we have, it's long before there's a real connection to mainland Asia. It's before glazed pottery or porcelain was invented. So we see locally made earthenware pottery, like this circle stamp piece here, that show design motifs that connect Banda to other parts of island Southeast Asia. Lots and lots of pigs. We find obsidian, this volcanic glass I mentioned earlier, which was imported from some other island. We don't know where yet, but we're trying to figure that out. Another stone tool material chert, which probably comes from a nearby island, but not from the Bandas. And then interesting things like this, probably this game piece. I have a real interest in games in archaeology, and have found other games in other parts of the world. They're kind of this unspoken trade good that moves around with more prosaic things like pots, but games move around too. At that Neolithic site, we also really focused on plants. Archaeologists have slowly come around to recognizing how important plants are to people. And it takes some special methods to be able to get plant remains out of sites. So I collaborated with Kyung-Ah Lee, who's up in the purple shirt up there. She's now at the University of Oregon, but she's an archaeobotanist or a plant specialist. And she joined us in the field and then helped train Nia here, who's an Indonesian archaeologist in those methods. And Nia has now become one of Indonesia's leading archaeobotanists. So there they are taking some dirt or sediment from the site and drying it out. And then we rinse it and float it, and seeds float to the surface. And Nia down here is drying out these little bags of sediment that we can analyze and see what plant remains are in. And what we found from those sites was really interesting. So on this, the bold items are things that we actually found, and the non-bold are things we looked for but we didn't find. So I'll just point out one thing. Sago here is a really important plant starch. I'll show you a picture in a little bit. That is a food, starchy food, and it does not grow on the Banda, so it would have been imported from somewhere, some other island. So even 3,500 years ago, people were trading to get food from other places. And then we also found nutmeg actually on a pottery sherd. So this is the earliest use of nutmeg by human, earliest consumption use of nutmeg anywhere in the world. So kind of cool. One of the studies we did was using that earthenware pottery as well as pig bones, and analyzing the chemistry of those pots to figure out where they were made, where the clay came from. And we found that the people in Banda had pots from all over the place, even 3,000 years ago. So as many as 10 or 12 different sources of pottery from other islands in Eastern Indonesia. And we also found that that the trade intensity or connectedness, what we call connectedness of people to other places, wasn't the same through time. It actually went up and down. And so there's this real kind of peak of trading here around 33,000 years ago. And then that drops off towards, as we get towards the end of the Neolithic, around 2,500 years ago, a real drop off in trade, and people are really relying more on locally made pottery. It's an interesting pattern. This is the work of one of my students, Emily Peterson, in her dissertation. It's a pattern you also see in other parts of the Pacific in the same time period. So big question about why is that change happening? So in the last, I guess, maybe 10 years, I have focused my efforts archaeologically in islands outside of Banda to really try to build a more clear picture of the regional trade network. So you're looking at a map here of the Maluku province. There's actually Maluku and North Maluku, Banda Islands down here. And I've been working kind of in this area here to see what connections people had with those islands. So we've been doing lots of archaeology, but we also rely on other information sources. There's some great studies of trade movements from the 1980s. You'd think, oh, well, that's so recent. Why would that be relevant? But actually that tells you a lot about things like ocean currents and wind patterns, and maybe more ancient networks that can give you some ideas about what was happening in ancient times. And then also languages can tell you a little bit maybe about histories of connections between people. When people share languages or have similar languages, there's maybe some clues that they were connected in the past. So I started becoming interested in this wider region because I became friends with this guy. His name is Lape. Sadly, he's passed away I think about 10 years ago now. But he welcomed me on his ship. This is his ship in the background, the Orang Datang, that he built by hand. And this is a trading ship, still using sails. And he would go take trips from Banda to other nearby islands to get things like sago, but also to trade things like cigarettes and plastic buckets and mattresses and kind of all the material culture of 1990s life in Indonesia. And I was able to join him on a week-long trip to Seram. And it was really illuminating as an archaeologist to kind of see, practically speaking, how these trade voyages worked. So I've got a little video, just a short clip here on his ship, me in much skinnier days up on the right there. So there's Laade and one of his crew members, Laane. You might be able to hear the put, put, put of this single cylinder diesel engine. No muffler, really loud. I was so grateful when we got the sails up and there's some wind and we could shut that thing down. So anyway, a wonderful trip week that gave me a lot of insight into this region. And the places we went were, I went back in 2015 to do archaeology, to collect clay samples and pottery, analyze those chemically, and see what kind of connections there were to Banda, and there was lots. And this is kind of what my current research is looking at these wider connections. So here's this is our 2015 trip to the Seram Island. We found the source of that chert, the stone tool that we find in the Banda Islands. And found lots of pottery and also got some interesting chronological data about sites in this area. And then in 2019, which is the last time I was able to go to Indonesia before pandemic shut down the country to visitors, we did this trip here. So the Banda Islands are this tiny speck here. And we chartered a ship and surveyed these islands in this group here which are otherwise quite difficult to get to in terms of public transport. So really, we chartered this ship, a kind of traditional Indonesian ship, but it's actually a liveaboard dive tourist ship, actually quite comfortable and lovely, and a wonderful platform for research to do some of these surveys. So I brought a couple of UW students and my colleague Sven Hawkinson, who brought his drone and took these wonderful photos of that trip. And we found some amazing sites, including this almost 30,000-year-old rock shelter site on Watu Bella Island. Some lots and lots of pottery showing connections to Banda and other places. All these incredible islands, most of which have not been looked at by archaeologists yet until we got there. And incredible rock art, which there's no rock art in Banda. There's no limestone cliffs like this, so it's not a good substrate for rock art, but we found some extensive rock art panels in some of these islands. So that's kind of where my work sits in terms of archaeology. And it's kind of been on pause for the last 2+ years. We're waiting for things to open up and hoping to go back and do some more extensive excavations on some of those islands I just showed you as soon as we can. So we've got everything in place, permits, our team, money. We're just waiting for conditions to ease a little bit. So I want to turn now kind of the final act of the 3-act play this morning and talk about, what do we do with all this information about both from history and archaeology about the spice trade? What good is it? I mean, I find it kind of deeply interesting on its own, but I also wonder, why do we care about any of this stuff? So I don't know how many of you know this writer, Amitav Ghosh, but I can highly recommend. He's one of my favorite writers. He's an anthropologist by training, maybe a historical anthropologist or anthropological historian might be the best way to describe him. And a wonderful storyteller and writer with lots and lots of interest in the histories of Asia and its connection to Europe and the Americas. He lives in New York. And this is his most recent book that just came out, I think about a month and a half ago, called The Nutmeg's Curse, and it's centered on the Banda Islands. So of course, one of my favorite writers writing about a place that I'm really deeply connected to. I was first in line to get a copy of this book. And Ghosh uses Banda and the Dutch massacre as kind of a parable for kind of the problems that we face now, particularly climate change, but also economic inequality, racism, et cetera, kind of all the big things that are facing us right now. He writes it during the pandemic, and that plays a big part of his personal story about writing the book. That's pretty interesting too. So anyway, it's on the reading list that I think Xiaojin shared, and I recommend the book. I was also disappointed, and I think a criticism of the book could be that Ghosh really didn't look at the deeper history of the Banda Islands. The parable about it is centered around the Dutch massacre of 1621. And by missing that, I think he also misses a potential source of solutions to some of these major issues we're facing right now that are kind of sitting there right in front of us. So if we'd only just take a look. And so I guess in my attempt to kind of end on a positive note this morning, and I'm in deep need of some optimism, I think many of us are, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about if we change our focus just a little bit and look a little bit deeper in time to what history can tell us. So what I see as kind of a story of resilience and survival in the Bandas has a lot to do in part with this kind of living cultural heritage. So people in this region pay attention to history. They are connected to their history, and it goes way deep, and it's very active. This is just an example here on this little village on Watabella Island, where they have a bronze figure, it's elephant on top of this kind of temple. I don't know if you can see it in the photo here. Probably made in Vietnam, maybe 1500 years ago, somehow ended up on this tiny island in eastern Indonesia. People here have built a little shrine around this elephant, and this is an object that tells you about the weather. So the elephant's trunk has to be pointed in this direction to keep storms away. Now this thing would probably, I don't know what the value would be. Maybe Natalia could tell us on the art market, a piece like this, but I'm sure it's worth some money. But it's out here unprotected. It's been stolen a couple times by local people, and they always run into big problems. And they always end up bringing the elephant back and pointing him in the right direction. So I think there's a parable there as well that's about paying attention to our history and taking care of it. That's useful. There's also an amazing economy in Eastern Indonesia that's local, or regional maybe. People are connected to each other deeply from island to island by things like this trade in sago. This guy here is producing sago. So he's extracting the starch from the wood of the tree. They use dugout canoes as kind of the big tubs of water to do that. These folks down here are making iron knives and machetes and things like that. So they use car parts, car springs, and they've got a forge, and they're manufacturing these things, and they're known across the region for their highest quality machetes. They are craftsmen and traders, and they've connected each other and the wider world to their craft. Oop. And then going back to the massacre, when the Dutch came into Banda in 1621, they did kill a lot of people, but when they put their thumb down on Banda, most people actually escaped and went to other islands. And I think a lot about kind of the refugee and migrant crisis that we face now across the world. These people from Banda, many of them moved to other places and kind of set up families and villages in other islands. And to this day, 400 years later, they connect their history and their culture back to Banda, even though they haven't actually lived in the Banda Islands for generations. So for example, these guys down here on this village of Rumadan in Seram have daily practice rituals that connect them to a clan on Banda. And I believe this is from the village of Lontor, so where their clan came from. They remember this connection, and it's really, really important in their daily life. So even though they're not physically traveling necessarily back and forth, they have this remembered connection to people. And it really is this connection that I think that gives me hope. So I'll leave, as I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy working with kids and find them to be some of my favorite partners. And these are some kids on Chimere Island who, kid in the middle there, you can tell he's probably 10 years old or 11 years old. He's going to grow up to be the Raja of this island. You can already tell. These kids are having a good time. They're smiling and they're optimistic for the future. And it's because of their connection to this place. So that's where I'm going to choose to put my optimism to. So with that, I thank all of you for your kind attention. And I have lots of other people on the screen to thank too for all my work over the years. And thanks again to Sam for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that wonderful talk. As a reminder for the discussion, please post any of your questions on the Q&A. I've seen some in the chat, and we'll start with those first. But for the remainder of the time that we have, it's easier if you put it in the Q&A section, and we'll address as many questions as possible in the time that we have. So Peter, thank you so much. You kind of went through a lot of the themes that we have been discussing throughout this lecture series on plunders and collectors. And you began, with the spices. And one of the participants, Larry, is asking, did nutmeg and cloves get to Europe via China and the Silk Road before the Dutch, or did Islamic traders obtain it from Banda?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm working with a couple European archaeologists to see if we can get some deeper history of nutmeg and cloves. The earliest physical evidence we have of nutmeg in Europe or the British Islands is actually from Scotland. They found nutmeg residue in a sewer drain, of all places, dating to about 1420. So we don't know the route that would have taken into Europe. There's lots of documents of the Silk Road route carrying nutmeg, as well as the maritime Silk Road route. So it's possibly from either, but we don't know how deep it goes in terms of European connection. In terms of Middle East or China, clear documentary reference to nutmeg dating back to the 9th or 10th century. So quite early, but I think Europe might have come a little bit later, but I think that's still to be determined.
And you spoke a little bit about the medicinal purposes of nutmeg. Can you speak a little bit about kind of the religious significance of the clove, or kind of other significance besides it being kind of for consumption?
Yeah, there's so I know a little bit less about cloves. So I am a nutmeg person. Nutmeg is it's a really interesting plant. It has if you take enough of it, it has hallucinogenic properties. So there's a famous passage in Malcolm X's autobiography about smoking nutmeg in prison. It was sort of this legal drug you could get into prison. And I think some of the early beat poets talk about nutmeg as well. There's, I think, a TikTok fad of smoking nutmeg. So it's got this kind of drug aspect, I guess, recreational or maybe religious aspect to drugs that may have a fairly ancient tradition. I think that's still to be determined. And like a lot of drugs, I actually just taught a class on drugs at UW, so I'm really deep into drugs right now, not as a user, but as a historian of drugs. Many drugs have kind of religious origins. So either they are used in religious practice or they're used only by priests or kind of religious leaders. And I suspect nutmeg may have some similar connection because pretty much every other drug has that, but I don't have any direct evidence for that. Maybe that's a future research project.
And there's a specific question about that wonderful map that you showed with the walls. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the materials and techniques used to build such fortification.
Sure. Yeah, this is so those walls were made out of mostly coral chunks. So people would go into the coral reef and break off chunks of coral, bring them on, and stack them up. They also, I believe this came with the Dutch a little later, but there was a mortar, kind of like a cement that you could make by burning coral in a fire and turning it into this kind of adhesive cement that the Dutch used for a lot of their buildings. My work in East Timor, Timor-Leste, was really all about those forts. So in the early 2000s, I spent about 5 years working in Timor, studying fortifications. And there's all kinds of different constructions of those. Sometimes they use like natural rock outcrops or cliff faces and then build on those. They're mostly dry stacked stone. And they're really, in terms of like the technology of forts, there's a real history of fortification layout coming out of Europe. So they're constantly trying to improve forts against various kinds of enemies like ships or land forces or cannons or whatever. Similar kinds of technology in Southeast Asia. So a different set of weapons they're guarding against and kind of forces. So they look very different, but they're impressive. There's a fort in the island of Sulawesi that the walls are something like 3 kilometers long. So massive, massive, massive constructions. Very understudied, very, very interesting.
With that, kind of, I'm just marveling at kind of, sometimes we think of, in collecting in terms of, as you said, some of the sculptures, but here we have a lot of the material culture and how that circulates. I was wondering if you could speak more about your own experience and talk a little bit about some of the items that you have found during your digs in the Banda Islands.
Yeah. So one of the things I often have to explain to my partners in Indonesia, or especially my non-archaeologist collaborators, is why I'm so interested with these teeny tiny broken, dirty pieces of pottery. And people just are puzzled by that. I'll get questions like, can you sell this in America? Is this valuable? Like, why would you, or I would often actually get people who would go, they'd feel bad for me, sweating away, digging these holes. And so they'd go dig up some pottery and bring it to me in bags. And I'd have to say, no, please don't do that. So yeah, actually I had a picture, I took it out of the slideshow today of like my favorite artifacts. And it's this bag of dirty earthenware pottery. To me, those things hold more information than the most beautiful bronze or, celadon pot that you might find. So the little microscopic plant remains, the chemistry that tells you where those things come from. So in terms of like objects or collecting, I really am all about the information, and I'm just not, I certainly see how beautiful some of those Chinese pots are, and I aesthetically enjoy them, but they kind of leave me cold in terms of information. I find that I'm really intrigued with the microscopic and the hidden that comes from these kind of ugly, dirty things. So I don't know if that quite answers that question. I don't think it does, but feel free to send a follow-up my way. That was probably more of a rant than anything.
No, so you kind of you've encountered more shards more than anything.
Yeah.
Because then there was someone followed up and said, have you found anything unexpected, surprising during those digs that you were not supposed to kind of encounter?
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, lots of things. May not sound that surprising to people who weren't there, but I guess I'm trying to think of some good stories here. Well, one, so that the site, I showed a picture of the top of that 10-foot tall wall. Just off the frame of that photo, we had another excavation unit, so about a 2 by 2 meter hole we're digging down. And this is my 2009 project with had students from UW and other universities all over Asia. And we were pretty deep down. We were trying to get the wall, and we're trying to get a piece of like the village that was inside the wall. So we're working our way down pretty deep, and we ran into a human skeleton. And in the skeleton, in the eye sockets were 2 coins. And we got permission from the local elder we weren't allowed to take the skeleton out and analyze it, but he did allow us to look at the coins. And they were VOC, or Dutch East India currency, from like 1815, I think was the date on the coin. So way down on the bottom of this, what we thought was a 1,000-year-old village, was this 19th century burial. Of course, that's how burials work. You dig a hole into, I think what's interesting, there's a whole story that goes with that, because the student who took the coin off, she was really interested in that coin. The next day, she got an infection in her eye. She is a contact lens wearer, and actually I had prohibited contacts, but she wore them anyway, and actually got a terrible eye infection, and we had to evacuate her out to get her to a hospital. And of course, the local people said, well, of course this happened. And actually, I kind of agree with them. You mess with these skeletons in their eyes, this is what you get. So these are the kind, often in the Bandas I find, or in Indonesia, you get kind of wrapped up in this magical world that becomes more and more real the longer you're there. So again, I didn't really answer your question, but I told you a story about, I guess, a surprising turn of events, maybe more than a surprising thing.
Well, I was surprised to encounter that skeleton. Maybe it wasn't so surprising to you. We have two questions about the population, Banda population, and the massacre relating to it. So I'll say one, and then when you answer, I'll ask the other one. So what portion of the original Banda population returned after the massacre? You spoke a little bit at the end about how some fled to neighboring islands. Did they return and kind of repopulate the islands?
Yeah, great question. So there's not great estimates, but I'd say rough estimate is about 10% of the population survived the massacre and stayed in Banda. And actually, they were turned into enslaved people by the Dutch. But they were actually critical because they knew how to grow nutmeg and process nutmeg. So the Dutch really needed that indigenous knowledge. So they were allowed to stay. It was probably more women and children than men because of the dynamics of conflict. And so what has survived in terms of indigenous knowledge in Banda has to do more with the, I would say, women's realms. So which are different in Indonesia than they might be in other places. For example, women are usually the owners of ships. They're kind of like the capitalist controllers of funding, let's say, or capital. Women tend to be, whereas the men are like one step below, like they're the captains of the ships, but they don't own the ships. So kind of interesting gender differences in Banda. Anyway, so those people stay and they keep alive some traditions that survive to this day. And also a lot of foodways, a lot of cuisine, I think, has survived from the early times. Now, what's really interesting is this May was the 400th anniversary of the massacre of 1621. So in 2021. And there's some commemorative activities. I was involved in some. And the magic of the internet and Zoom, which has also hit Indonesia, has allowed the refugee populations, the descendants of those refugees from 400 years ago, to have Zoom meetings with people in Banda, descendants of people who didn't leave. And there's been this incredible coming back together of those people. And I was part of a thing in May where a man who lives on a distant island who's never been to Banda gifted a song to the Bandanese people that was in the old Bandanese language, which was lost in Banda itself. The language disappeared. And it was this incredible emotional reunion, I'd say, like a cultural reunion that sparked now. And then the people in Banda invited him to come, and we found money to pay for his trip. He's bringing other people. So it's like this terrible event, and the magic of Zoom, I guess, in the pandemic has brought this kind of new chapter of revisiting this history. So yeah, so really a lot of interesting things going on right now in Banda. I can't wait to get back there and kind of see what's going on with people. Really cool.
And related, you spoke a little bit about the Romanian communities from Banda. This particular question asks that is it true that many refugees ended up in Taiwan because of the VOC connection?
That's a good question. I haven't heard of that, but that would certainly make sense. Yeah, that questioner knows anything or knows some records that might get some information about that. That'd be really cool. I know there's some evidence of Banda refugees being in as far away as Cape Town, South Africa, which was a big stop for the VOC. Definitely in Bay of Bengal part of South Asia, maybe as far away as Europe, probably. So yeah, they kind of dispersed everywhere. And there's a lot of them went to Batavia, which became Jakarta, which is the biggest kind of the capital city of Indonesia right now. And there's a section of Jakarta called Kampung Banda, which means Banda neighborhood, which presumably is from those first refugees in 1621, kind of setting up a little, place to live in Batavia. So yeah, I'd love to, if anyone knows more about the Taiwan connection, I'd be really interested to know. Makes sense that they would go up there too, for sure.
And then we had two people ask this question. If you could also expand, which was not touched too much in your talk, on the presence of the Japanese mercenaries in other parts of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, great question. I gave a talk for a colleague of mine who's Japanese at Berkeley, Junko Habu, who's a Japanese archaeologist. I talked about the Japanese, I showed that picture with the Japanese mercenaries, and she had a million questions about that. And it got me interested. I hadn't really paid, honestly, that much attention to that kind of little side story, but it got me interested, and she sent me some information about these people. I think they were, what she tells me, and I'm definitely not an expert on this, is that those folks were exiled from Japan and I'm not sure the original reason for this, but they're kicked out of Japan and they become this kind of roving force available for hire. And the VOC really takes advantage of them, and they're used in several other instances to support VOC troops. The Dutch East India, at that point, they didn't really have a military force. Later, they build on that. Actually, that's kind of what causes the VOC to eventually go bankrupt is paying for the necessary military arm that they had to enforce this kind of a violent colonial imposition. Became more and more expensive, and finally was unsustainable. So yeah, I think the Japanese stories I'm planning to dive into that, and I think there's some really interesting stories to tell about those people and what they were doing there and what their stories were and what happened to them. I'm guessing maybe some of them ended up settling down in these places, once they kind of age out of the military. And maybe, who knows? I don't know. Really fascinating. But I don't know much about it, unfortunately, yet.
This is another question about kind of the global Asian trade occurring within Southeast Asia. This comes from Michael Ruby. He says, we had a lecture several years ago about a sunken Chinese trading ship in eastern Indonesia. Was there not a conflict between the Dutch and Chinese traders in and around Banda or around Indonesia?
Yeah, the Chinese were, as we can tell from the ceramics we find in Banda, were very, very intensely involved in trade in eastern Indonesia and western Indonesia. I'm not sure there's been several Chinese shipwrecks from the Java Sea area, so more western Indonesia, and I've been able to view some of the collections from those shipwrecks that have been recovered. Really, really useful and interesting for archaeologists. But yeah, the Chinese were there. They played a really interesting role during, especially post-massacre, when the Dutch are trying to kind of lock down Indonesia in this monopoly trade. They also come to realize that they can't. There's a lot of smuggling going on, of course, but also the trade, the Chinese were facilitating this trade that allowed Banda really to exist. Those 15,000 people could not survive on the food that's produced on the Banda Islands. They had to import things like sago starch from other islands. And so if you lock down the trade too much, people are going to starve to death. And the Dutch quickly realized they've got a problem on their hands of they're trying to regulate nutmeg trade, but also facilitate local food trade. And the Chinese end up becoming this kind of critical piece for that, where the Dutch basically allow them to kind of get away with a certain amount of like smuggling, quote unquote, of nutmeg in exchange for them also bringing this local food and kind of supporting not only the Dutch, but the enslaved people who lived there. So fascinating thing that goes on that to this day, there's a very strong Chinese community in Banda and all over Maluku. And I've become really good friends with some of the folks there who maintain their connection to China through language and culture, and play this, still to this day, play this some really important part in regional trade. They often own like the stores in the villages, and they have small trading ships that move goods around, like kind of like the semi trucks of the Maluku Sea. So moving, whatever, bottled water and cigarettes and things like that are often moved by the Chinese trade network. Yeah, really, really interesting with a deep history.
This is related in terms of, but shifting more back to the objects, this comes from Wendy, that there was a big kind of technological shift in terms of from pottery, from earthenware, from China. From this knowledge transmission, does it depend on knowing how to control higher temperature ovens in the fire pots or on fine, or the materials itself on the fine grained clay?
Yeah, I mean, it's really both. You need the right kinds of clays, and you have to understand how to make a kiln, like a high enough temperature to get glaze to melt and get the clay to basically transform. Yeah, and this technology does not seem to have been in existence in Eastern Indonesia, although I found quite a bit of evidence of iron forging, so which would require similar levels of kind of a temperature control. So what I think is going on is that there's so much good quality Chinese pottery coming in. There's no economic incentive to make it locally. I mean, it's maybe like the way Americans consume Chinese goods now, and manufacturing has died in the US because it doesn't make economic sense to manufacture things when they can be imported more cheaply. So whereas metal implements are, because they're often weapons, they're more regulated, and there's more incentive, I think, to make local weapons. And also you can recycle a lot of metal and kind of remake it into things. So yeah, I think it's a interesting, you might think, well, people are making pottery all the time, why don't they make porcelain too? But I think that's what's going on there. And they never really do make porcelain until very late, like 19th century, finally you start to see some high-fired ceramics made in Indonesia. But before that, not. Whereas like in Cambodia or Thailand, they're making them, 1,000 years ago. So really interesting.
In your talk, you talked a lot about how Asia was present in Banda in terms with the various artifacts that you found. In the other direction, have Banda artifacts been found in Vietnam or other Asian countries?
Yeah, no. As far as I know, no. And I think what we have to look at is what things would be coming out of Banda and going to those places, and it's probably things that are less durable. So, what the records tell us is that it's really like agricultural products that are leaving, or forest products. So we've got the spices. Unless you're really looking carefully and using the right methods, those are hard to detect archaeologically, and they're not going to capture the attention of archaeologists. More and more we're looking at those things, but traditionally, no. And they're not pretty, like they're not gold or things like that. So they don't capture the interest quite so much. I think the there's other interesting forest products that come out of this region, things like beeswax. There's a famous shipwreck off the coast of Oregon called the Beeswax Wreck. I don't know if folks have heard about that. It's occasionally in big storms, and probably like right now, chunks of wax wash on shore in Cannon Beach area. And there's a shipwreck just offshore that's been there for several hundred years. And it was bringing wax probably from the Philippines. And so the limestone caves where we see the rock art, there's also these huge bees nests that make these massive kind of wax things that you can chunk off and make candles. And like the Spanish needed a lot of candles to run all their churches and missionaries. They imported tons and tons of wax from Southeast Asia. So anyway, that's the kind of stuff that you probably see in other parts of Asia, but it's hard to find. It doesn't survive very well in the record.
I have so many questions with beeswax, but I want to get to the audience questions. There was, I kind of talked a little bit when your interest is about climate change. So to what extent are you concerned that these important archaeological features are threatened by the sea level rise?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually, one of my little side projects is studying the sea level record. I should have pointed this out in one of my photos. There was a sea level rise kind of famously called the mid-Holocene high stand about 5,000 years ago. There was something that was going on in the polar ice caps where you got this little surge of meltwater and sea levels rose in Southeast Asia about 3 feet or a meter, and they stayed high for about 1,000 years, and they dropped back down to current levels. And that has actually impacted, if you're looking for a 10,000-year-old site on the coast, it probably was washed away by that high stand at 5,000 years ago. So you have to pay attention to the sea level rise when you're trying to do archaeology, because it affects your record. So yeah, we may be facing a similar rise in the next few hundred years, which will potentially wipe out sites. And that's why we want to understand the history of the sea level rise to see what it does. I'm also thinking that that high stand 5,000 years ago also impacted coral reef productivity and may have been one of the things that got people eating pigs, because before, pigs really don't show up till like 3,500 years ago. And I think there's something going on really important in this Neolithic period in Southeast Asia where people suddenly change a lot of stuff. And I think it may have something a little bit to do with that kind of climate-driven change that would have impacted, marine ecosystems quite a bit. So it's one of my side projects. I have a collaborator here at UW who's a climate change person. And we've been collecting samples and trying to understand kind of rainfall and sea level in this area to get that picture more filled out.
Related to the environment and the geography, how active are the volcanoes in Banda? And do they influence any material culture such as tsunami walls?
Yeah, great question. They're active. There's one. It's called Gunung Api, which just means volcano or fire mountain. And it last had a big eruption in 1988 and hasn't erupted since, but it's definitely, I've climbed up to the top. It's got a crater, lots of steam coming out and that kind of thing. So it's an active volcano. It definitely impacts, like I showed you the picture of that buried wall. If you're near that volcano, your sites are going to be under snow drifts of volcanic ash and tephra. So it really affects how visible the archaeological sites are and how deep you have to go to get to stuff. Volcanic ash is also very acidic, so it's not good for preservation for things like bone or shell or things like that. So I found the best preserved older sites are the ones that are on the outer islands further away from the volcano, where you have less of an impact there. So yeah, I'm constantly thinking about that volcano for sure. and heard lots of stories about that 88 eruption. I think about 10 or 15 people were killed during that eruption. They had to evacuate everyone from a couple of the islands. The Navy sent in a ship and just took everyone away for like a month and then brought them back. And there's a great, when it erupted, there was a new lava flow, and it killed the coral reef, kind of went into the water and killed the reef there. And then the reef grew back really quickly, much more quickly than people ever thought. And it's a great snorkeling site that we'd go to once a week for beautiful, some of the best snorkeling in the world in these islands, by the way. If you ever, highly recommend going there when you can. They're just a beautiful place.
There's a few questions about travel, which we'll end on.
Okay.
So keep those tidbits of snorkeling. People do want to know. There was I wanted to get to this. This question was who's from Anonymous, but we talked a little bit about that fort in Sulawesi. Could you speak a little bit more about that fort and what region in Sulawesi it's located in?
Yeah, it's I'm blanking on the name of the town right now. I'm sorry. It'll probably come to me after this talk. It's in South Sulawesi, and I believe it's on. So there's Makassar is kind of the big city in South West Sulawesi. Sulawesi, this big spidery arm island, and there's a couple arms that stick down to the south, and then some bigger islands down there. Really interesting area. Actually, that guy Laade, the captain who took me on his trip in '98, his ancestry is from that part of Sulawesi, not Makassar, but a little bit to the east, this area called Bone. And that's where that big fort is, I believe, is in the Bone region. And I just can't remember the name of the town, but you can go there. It's a bit of a tourist. There's 5 tourists a year go visit it, but it's kind of like a monument that's been preserved, and you can walk around and there's signage on it and stuff. And yeah, worth checking out for sure. Yeah.
One question regards a different island of Rune, and someone's asking if you know. I'm not familiar with Cal Mueller. Maybe they.
Yeah. I wonder if this person has been on a trip with him. Yeah, I know him. And Rune, I didn't mention this, I should have, but and Rune was, when the Dutch took over the Bandas, the English were also involved there too, and they held on to Rune for a while. And eventually they ended up in this tiny little islet just off of Rune called Nailaka. And there's a great book, I think it's in my reading list I suggested, called Nathaniel's Nutmeg by Giles Milton. That's all about this guy Nathaniel, who's kind of the last English holdout in Nailaka, which is this tiny little speck. It's about 40 feet across. He lived there for a couple of years. But anyway, eventually the Dutch and the English in 1687 have a treaty where they reach an agreement and they trade Rune for which was held by the English, for a Dutch piece of land in the Americas called Manhattan. So Manhattan and Rune were swapped, and Manhattan went from being Dutch to being English, and Rune went from being English to being Dutch. So there were some other land swaps in that deal too, but people in Rune know this story very well. When you go there, and you're from America, they like to remind you that look how much better Rune is than Manhattan, which I might agree. I like them both.
And I wanted to end with some comments and some questions about travel, not particularly to your talk, but this comes just from Janet Baker. She just wanted to thank you for a wide-ranging discussion and thought-provoking exploration of past, present, future cultural interactions. And yeah, there were many comments in the chat, Peter. I know you can't see them all, but saying how much they enjoyed your talk. One of our attendees, this was one of the first questions, but I want to save it towards the end, whose family is from the area of Banda.
Oh, really?
And they were wondering that they've always wanted to kind of travel to that area. What is your kind of personal experience traveling there? I know with COVID, there are new complications that are rising, but if and when COVID doesn't become such a prevalent part of our lives, is it a very easy access point? Do you recommend traveling there, etc.?
Yeah, well, that's so cool that this person's has history there. And I'm sorry I'm not able to quickly look at the chat, but thank you for all the kind comments. Much appreciated. Yeah, so Banda is, you can go there as a tourist, and I'd highly recommend it. It's just an amazing, wonderful, beautiful, lovely place. It is very different from everywhere else in Indonesia. A lot of the Dutch colonial architecture is still standing. It's a little bit, like after World War II, so the Japanese come in Indonesia, kind of kick the Dutch out, and the Dutch never really kind of come back. Banda had already, by the 40s, was already kind of a sleepy place. Nutmeg grows in other parts of the world now. It's actually the biggest producer is in the Caribbean, the island of Grenada. So Banda kind of became forgotten. It's so far out there and remote. So it left preserved this incredible colonial history. And it's still to this day absolutely there. I was lucky enough I have a friend who's Indonesian who owned one of these Dutch colonial houses, and she rented it to me when I was doing my first field work there. And these are stone, beautiful, incredible, huge mansions, with no electricity or running water, but amazing places to live. And so there's some really beautiful, like little hotels you can stay in. It's a place to get, I'd say, kind of do cultural tourism as well as kind of natural tourism. Like I said, it's some of the best marine environments in the world. It's a very special place in terms of marine biodiversity. The islands are beautiful to walk around on. The people are amazing. It's got a lot of dark history, but despite that, it's a great place. The one challenge is getting there is never easy. In the best of times, there's a little airport, but they can't seem to keep flights going there regularly. And otherwise, it's at best a 12-hour sea voyage from the city of Ambon. And the seas can be rough. And yeah, it's a commitment to get there. And then sometimes when you get there, you can't leave. That's happened to me many times. So I'd recommend going if you are not on a tight schedule. If you can really be flexible, and that's really true for any travel, especially these days. But if you can just kind of keep an open schedule, go there and reach out to me, anyone who's planning to go, and I can connect you to great people to meet and places to stay and places to see. So I hope to go myself as soon as possible. So maybe I'll see you there.
Yeah, that question came from Brian Kimmel, who his family's from Banda, is interested in researching his ancestry a bit more and going there for the first time, it seems.
Cool.
So you may Brian, hear from him.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Brian.
So that's just a great note to draw us to a close, bringing connections. We loved hearing from all of you. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions and not in order, but I tried to group them as much as possible related. Again, thank you to Peter for staying exactly at time. We just had so many questions. So thank you for your patience with us.